Since President Trump took office, he's been charged with replacing 2 Supreme Court justices, providing the opportunity to appoint younger conservative voices, which could affect rulings for decades. With Justices Ginsburg and Breyer both of advanced age, there's speculation the president could appoint a third before the end of his first term. Supreme Court picks have been skewing younger than in the past, meaning justices are serving for longer. And now some on both sides of the aisle are arguing for term limits. CBSN political contributor and Boston Herald columnist Michael Graham published an article Monday outlining why, during a time marked by political divisions, conservatives and liberals have found common ground when it comes to the Supreme Court. He's here with us now. Michael, always great to see you. First of all, what are the arguments on both sides for Supreme Court term limits?
Well, the argument for term limits from the right has always been that they believe that the court is too powerful and that they fear that it often acts as a unelected legislature, and so it imposes itself into decisions. And this particularly goes back to Roe versus Wade. We could argue same-sex marriage, Obamacare. And so the theory is that when you have people who are appointed by, say, President Ford, President H.W. Bush, as we do today, there have been numerous elections and election cycles since then. And so these, the philosophy of the people, the will of the people, if you will, may have been different 30, 40 years ago. In fact, it probably was. And so the court should reflect at some level, within some restrictions, the thinking of the people, where sovereignty comes from. On the left, this is they are newly minted fans of Supreme Court term limits. And I think it's no coincidence that the day after Justice Kennedy announced his resignation, suddenly a flurry of articles appeared in the Washington Post, and at left-leaning Vox.com, and the Chicago Tribune. Hey, term limits, maybe a good thing. Also, backed by another conversation we've talked about here on CBSN, the idea of the possibility of court packing. That is, a future Democratic president and a future Democratic Senate might actually create more seats on the Supreme Court so they could have a majority that's bigger than the one that they might be left by a President Trump.
Well, what are people suggesting the term limits would look like?
Well, one theory that's been talked about quite a bit, and it comes from a paper written by a couple of conservative legal analysts back in 2006, would be the idea that justices would serve a single 18-year term. So 18 years, a long time, independent judiciary. And under the system they would use, there would be a new vacancy every 2 years. And they offer some interesting data for this. From the founding of our country until 1970, the average term of a Supreme Court justice was around 15 years. And there was a new vacancy every couple years or so. Since 1970, that's now up. The average term is 26 years in the courts. And we went from 1994 till mid-2005 with no vacancies. And that was not the plan, they argue, of the founders. And once again, it's the balance between you don't want a court that's merely a mob that's answering to the mood of the American people at that moment, but you also don't want a court that's so distant from the feelings of the people that they're applying justice of a previous generation onto a new generation.
So is it just longer lifespans? What is it that accounts for this increased time that Supreme Court justices are serving?
Well, certainly the longer lifespan is a part of it, no doubt about it. But you can see the strategy. The strategy became, I think, particularly politically apparent during the appointment of Clarence Thomas, who was a very young jurist at the time. Now he's one of the senior jurists, but he was a very young jurist at the time. And you see it going through. You have appointment from President Obama that was born in the mid-50s, and then one that was born in the 60s. Judge Gorsuch was born, I believe, in 67. Brett Kavanaugh's a young gentleman. And so you can see that there's a motive, there appears to be, I'll put it this way, and it's widely discussed from allies of both sides about a motive to affect the court for the future. But I think it's important to go back and note that there is a shift on the left. The premise of the left was that the court's job was to bring about social justice now. And the argument that the right made about, well, what about the law as it's written, and what about interpreting the founders? They say, no, it's a living constitution. And so they've always liked a kind of a separation, if you will, between these justices and the democratic process, because they want the justice to do the right thing. And of course, they define the right thing by, however they define it. If you get term limits, that brings the system back more into a democratic system. Every president's going to have an appointment every 2 years, and it makes it less likely that you will have a divergent opinion with such a wide gap. I think a good example is the same-sex marriage decision. Most analysts agree that America was going to have same-sex marriage on a state-by-state basis in a relatively short period of time. The polling was changing. States are already doing it. So when the Supreme Court stepped in, the argument from many on the right, some on the right thought it was just wrong. They just opposed it for moral reasons. But others said, no, the problem is the process. We don't want the Supreme Court doing this. Whereas the left said, we don't care how it gets done. Love triumphs. It's just got to be done. And that's, if you have term limits, a lot of that argument starts to fade and go away.
Well, what are some of the problems of justices serving for longer?
Well, once again, because you have the distance between the will of the people, if you will, of a current era, and then the time when the justices were appointed. I mean, nothing against President Gerald R. Ford, nothing against H.W. Bush, but having them have appointments on the court doesn't exactly resonate with the American people. And by the way, just a bit of trivia for everybody: the only 20th century president who appointed no justices was Jimmy Carter. So the voters who voted for Jimmy Carter had no say in the shape of the court. And of course, he only served one term. The person in the 20th century who appointed the most was William Howard Taft, who appointed 6. He also only served one term. But you can see that imbalance of, decades later, there's FDR fighting with a court that was appointed by a guy, presidents earlier, and saying, wait a minute, I'm trying to govern today. How do you balance that? And the argument from term limit supporters is that's the ways through the 18-year term limits.
Well, on Saturday, President Trump was in Ohio campaigning for Republicans. He emphasized electing lawmakers who will support his Supreme Court nominees. Why is this issue so important to his base, Michael?
Because again and again, they feel like that the court has been acting as a super legislature, deciding issues for them, whether it's the same-sex marriage ruling, which I think is the one that's the most apparent right now, but on other issues as well, flag burning and gun issues until recently the Heller decision. For a long time, the people that tend to vote for Trump, the talk radio audience where I worked for many years, they saw the Supreme Court as an ally of one of the partisan political teams. And so what they see President Trump doing is they see him reclaiming that court. And their argument would be this: it's not the same when our guy, the Republican, wins, because the Republicans tend to appoint jurists who they are pushing to follow the text of the law. And their argument is, if you don't like a law, go back to Congress and change it. You can pass anything you want, and our guys will stand for it, or gals, because they're following the text. The liberals argue, and they have legitimate points, that there are many times when the law lags behind social justice, and the law allows things that offend our sensibilities, and they want the courts to speed that process up. President Trump is saying to his audience, and they cheer every time he says it, I'm bringing you a conservative court that's going to largely leave you and your values alone.
So then, Michael, what would be the long-term effect if President Trump does, in fact, have the opportunity to nominate 3 justices?
Well, imagine that, a third of the court appointed by President Trump, one of the most, if not the most divisive presidents in the modern era. I think there would be a lot of people on the left very upset. I think you'd see renewed breath in this idea of court packing and possibly the term limits issue, although they would be applied retroactively, so it wouldn't change the court that President Trump picked. But I would just urge people to think about the issue of Roe versus Wade, the most contentious Supreme Court issue I think there is. What happens if you did have a court that ruled that the law was poorly settled on the law, which, by the way, is the opinion of many legal scholars, even legal scholars who support the right to abortion? They say the ruling was pretty much a mess. But what would happen is it would go back to the states. In other words, you wouldn't be denying anybody the right to decide what the law should be. They would be able to have abortion laws, not have them, have compromises state by state. And that is the argument that the right makes again and again. We are not trying to force an agenda on abortion or anything else through the Supreme Court. We're trying to get the court to stop forcing an agenda from Washington down and leave it to the states. People on the left argue that there's certain things that shouldn't be left to the voters of the state, that there are certain laws that are basic human rights and they should be protected at every level, and that's the combat. But in the end, you can see how you can make a compelling case for why shouldn't the people of New York and the people of Utah have different laws that reflect their local communities. And that's the case that people on the right make for their vision of the courts. I also think it's interesting, one of the people who's promoting this term limit law and who wrote our idea and wrote about it in 2006 is one of the co-founders of the Federalist Society, which is the conservative group that has been helping Donald Trump pick his judges. It would be hilarious to me if the left is so upset by Trump that they join the right with this idea for term limits, and the most profound reform of the Trump era is a backlash to Trump that lasts for years later as it affects how we choose our Supreme Court justices.
All right, I'm not ruling that possibility out, Michael, especially not in this day and age. What would it take? What would it take, though, for term limits to actually be implemented, and what's the likelihood that that could happen?
It would have to go through the constitutional amendment process, which is very laborious. You have to go to the states, the legislature, or have popular referenda, and then bring it up to Congress, and then Congress has to vote. And we have very few amendments because they're very difficult to do. But interestingly, I went back and looked. It's polling well now. Well, overwhelmingly, Americans say they support term limits on Supreme Court justices. But I went back. It's been polling well for at least a decade or so. And I think that shows that Americans get it, that the court has just been too politicized. And if every fight, for example, Brett Kavanaugh, I know people on the left don't want to hear this, but by every measure, he's qualified to be on the court. He's 13 years almost on the D.C. Court of Appeals. Tons of experience. There's plenty to evaluate there. This is a political fight, and it's a democracy. We're supposed to have those. But the American people sense that it's become too political, and I think that's one reason why they support it, which means if you have people back home on the left and on the right, both pushing it, that's what it takes to get a constitutional amendment through the process. And that's why I think this is something that if people got behind it, if some leaders got behind it, I wouldn't be surprised to see it make progress.
All right. We'll continue to watch it. Michael Graham, thanks so much, Michael.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.